Mike McConville here, one more time, Stratford, Ontario, Canada. I started into this 335 and I knew right away that something just wasn't quite right. Well, there were a bunch of weird things that were done to this guitar, but the weirdest thing, and I've heard of people doing this, but I've never done this, is they cut off the end of the fingerboard to compensate. You know, instead of making a compensated nut, they actually chopped off the fingerboard. Okay, here's the reconnaissance that I did to kind of figure out what the issue was with this guitar. The 13 and 5/16 is actually 12 and 5/16 because remember we're starting on 1. So that 12 and 5/16, if you double it, that gives us 24 and 5/8, which is the scale length. So I've traced that line across the nut, and then I've cut my compensation factors in based on that line, which was where the fingerboard was before this guy cut it off. I'm documenting this whole thing because this is another example where I end up spending more time going around in circles correcting someone else's mistakes than I would have if the guy had just come to me with his 335 and wanted compensated nut. I do not chop off the end of the fingerboard, ever, right? So what we have here is I have measured from the center of the 12th fret back to the edge of this fingerboard, and it was obvious that it had been chopped off. So I've put a nut blank in there, and that center line that you see that goes right across the nut, that represents where the end of the fingerboard should be. So I am going to make a compensated nut for this one. Of course, this guitar just would not tune. And if you look at my compensated nuts in a nutshell video, I specifically mentioned that each string on a compensated nut is in a different place, just like each saddle on the bridge is in a different place. You can't just chop off the end of the fingerboard and hope your guitar is going to be in tune. Unbelievable. This guitar is now surgically perfectly in tune. You could do a classical concerto on it. When it came into the shop, you couldn't tune it to save your life. I've seen many different case scenarios in the past where, you know, I've been the 5th shop that someone's brought their guitar to, and in this case, I don't know if it was 4th or 5th, but my first sort of indication that made me, I right out of the gate, I was a little bit suspicious about this when I measured that, and it is, oh sorry, I'm trying to steady the camera and the calibers at the same time, okay, 1.313 center to center. Well, this distance is also 1.313. So right away that tells you, everybody knows, you know, the frets are logarithmically spaced in the fingerboard. The distance from the nut to the 1st fret shouldn't be the same as the distance from the 1st fret to the 2nd fret. So right away that it rapidly became apparent at that point that the end of the fingerboard had been severed off, and then I made all my other judgment calls based on that, and that's how we got this thing to finally play perfectly in tune. So you can see by the shape of the replacement nut that the last guy had put in there that all of the strings were chased right to the leading edge. When you look at my replacement compensated nut, you can see that I've kind of chased the strings back into the body of the oversized nut, because the nut is quite a bit thicker than the standard nut that came with it, because obviously it needs to fill the space because the fingerboard was cut off. Anyway, end result is perfection. This thing is perfectly in tune now. Okay, I've bought back the real estate. This line here that goes straight across from side to side is indicative of where the fingerboard was before. What I've done here is I've cut the values in. Now the guitar intonates perfectly now. It's all 6 strings, each one is in a different position, like I explained in that other video. So we're basically done. The string spacing looks really good. Now we make it look pretty. This is what we ended up doing. This guitar is now perfectly in tune. So you can see how I've kind of chased the strings back, put relief cuts on the leading edge of the nut to put the strings back after this fingerboard had been severed. Now, I've heard of people doing that, you know, sort of cutting a fingerboard back, but Yeah, I just don't see the sense in doing that. I have a whole different way of doing it. We teach that in my level 2 class, and you never need to sort of alter the instrument to do a compensated nut. The guy had put, whoever, previously worked on this guitar, had put a Tone Pro bridge on, although one of the set screws was missing, but that's okay. It's still a good press fit. I did need to reverse the G-string saddle to get it back far enough to get that string to intonate. Pickups needed to be adjusted, like I mentioned in that previous Les Paul, tuning your Les Paul video, same thing. The actual pickup ring was cracked and the pickup had dropped down, so I didn't have quite a thin enough pickup ring, but I had the full thickness one, so I ended up sanding it down on my spherical disc sander gently, bit by bit by bit, and made a thinner pickup ring out of the thicker one. So that was done. The other thing that was part of the problem, part of the tuning problem on this guitar, is the actual fret installation was not too bad. I mean, he didn't chip the fingerboard or anything. The frets went in pretty clean. They are a big honkin' fret, like a very high fret. And of course, once the frets are leveled, all the frets need to be recrowned, because, as you know, I mentioned just earlier that because the frets are logarithmically placed, for the intonation to be perfect, the crown of the fret needs to be on center. So, when the frets start to wear out on your guitar, it's not just that you start to get buzzing and stuff, but this also affects your intonation, because now the string is no longer fretting in the center of the crown as the crown wears down. So I did re-crown and polish and chased all those crowns back to center. And intonated the bridge. Had to do a bit of, kind of re-engineering to get that bridge to behave itself as well. And of course, the real culprit was the nut that we discussed. Now, final call on this is, this goes for a lot of different guitars. We're still talking about tuning issues here. Because those frets are so high, you can't be death gripping those notes, because you'll pull them sharp. So there is going to be an adjustment period where the player needs to get used to the guitar and used to the feel of these frets. It plays great now, so it's perfectly in tune, but I just wanted to mention that, the very last call is that whole Zen thing of how hard you grip the string. If you just relax and play with a normal touch, a bit of vibrato if you want, bend the string, no problem, but if you just use a kind of regulated touch, this guitar plays perfectly in tune end to end.